Welcome back. So you're joining us for part two of our irony, sarcasm, and paradox review. And if you just watched part one, you know that you were introduced to irony. We talked about the three different types of irony. And what we're going to get into in part two are some examples and some text that reveals irony. And we're going to identify what those examples are and talk just in a little bit more depth about them. So specifically, we'll go over verbal irony, sarcasm, and situational irony. So make sure you have room in your notes to continue where we left off from part one. So know that with almost anything we talk about in these videos and the lessons we learn in our English classes, we're exposed to these things. They happen around us all day, every day, just like when we had our making inferences lesson. These are just things that we don't always realize are happening. So our figurative language lesson ended so 2 sessions ago, and what we talked about is the difference between literal language and figurative language. So this is when words are not to be taken literally. So I want you to remember that, because that's still how we're operating when we're not taking something as it appears. Okay, so they kind of are similar in that way. And so there are reasons why authors choose to use these elements in their writing or in their literary works, and that's what I want you to think about, why someone would choose to use that. Okay, so you're exposed to verbal irony and sarcasm in conversations, in music, comic routines, sitcoms, and many, many other forms. So I'm going to give you an example from The Simpsons. When Lisa Simpson said to her mother, Marge, in one episode, she said, quote, "I'm proud of you, Mom. You're like Christopher Columbus. You discovered something millions of people knew about before you," end quote. So in this moment, Lisa isn't actually proud of her mom. She's mocking her, and she's being what I like to call snarky or sarcastic, because we all know that you can't discover something if people already know about it. You didn't discover it. And so she made a historical connection, and The Simpsons creator is known for doing this. And so the irony of her statement depends on the fact that although Americans were unknown to the Europeans and Christopher Columbus when he discovered America, the fact is that historians have shown that there were millions of Native Americans that already existed, that already lived on this land. And so there are historians that would dispute the claim that Christopher Columbus discovered America, because if there were already people here that knew about it, then how could he have discovered it? And so that was the creator of The Simpsons sort of inserting that irony, and also giving Lisa a sarcastic tone when she made this statement to Marge. Okay, so that's just kind of a little segue into what we're going to talk about. So you'll see here that I said you were exposed to this in music, and that is so true. I like to use music and song lyrics whenever I can to sort of reiterate a point or to use as examples in what we're talking about in class. And so you'll see that in the next 2 slides, we have 2 different songs. So one, we're just going to look at a little snippet of the lyrics, and then we'll actually listen to some lyrics of a different song. And what we want to do is identify moments of irony. So that's what we're going to look for. Okay, so this example is going to be from a song that Kenny Rogers wrote. So in the lyrics, the narrator is talking to his wife. So because he's talking and using words, we're dealing with verbal irony. So we've gone over that. You know that if we're dealing with words that are unexpected or not meant to be taken literally, that we're talking about verbal irony. So he's going to use, he as in Kenny Rogers, Kenny Rogers. He uses verbal irony to emphasize the seriousness of a situation he's having with his wife, Lucille. So the wife, Lucille, leaves the husband at a particularly trying or difficult time. And so the song's lyrics repeat and elaborate on the husband's predicament or the situation that he's in an understated manner. So I'm going to just read this little snippet of lyrics, see if you can find something that seems off, that seems like he's understating something to make a point. You picked a fine time to leave me, Lucille. With 4 hungry children and a crop in the field, I've had some bad times, lived through some sad times. This time, the hurtin' won't heal. You picked a fine time to leave me, Lucille. So I'm just going to give you a couple seconds to look at that and think about where there might be some verbal irony, specifically in the form of an understatement. Okay, so if you pointed out the phrase fine time, then you most likely are starting to understand what it means to be ironic, because you'll see in the details that this is a difficult time. They have 4 hungry children and there are crops to be tended to, and this wife left this husband to deal with all of these difficult things on his own. And so the husband, especially repeating himself and saying that this is a fine time, is really not to be taken literally. This is anything but a fine time. This is more of a horrible time that she chose to leave him. So if you pointed that out, give yourself a pat on the back. You're doing fine. All right, so we're going to move on to an example of situational irony. And there are several examples in this song, so you may have heard it. So you can find irony not only in single sentences and expressions, but also in events, okay, or situations. So situational irony occurs when events turn out quite the opposite of what you may have predicted. So I chose the song Ironic by Alanis Morissette, which is one of my favorite songs, favorite 90s songs. I really like Alanis Morissette. So you may have heard this before, but even if you have or you haven't, it really doesn't matter. What I want you to do is, while the song plays, hold yourself accountable if you need to hit pause. And I chose the version that shows the lyrics on the screen. So if you need to pause to write something down, go ahead. At the end, I'm going to ask you what some of the examples that you noted were. So please take notes and we will go ahead and listen to this song.
No man turn 98. You won the lottery, died the next day. It's a black fly, your Chardonnay. It's a death row pardon, 2 minutes too late. Isn't it ironic? Don't you think? It's like rain. It's a free ride. When you're already there, it's the good advice that you just can't take. And who would have thought it figures? Used to play it safe, was afraid to fly. He packed his suitcase, kissed his kids goodbye. He waited his whole damn life to take that flight. And as the plane crashed down, listen to this night. Isn't it ironic? Don't you think? It's like rain. It's a free ride. already late. No smoking sign on your cigarette break. It's like 10,000 spoons when all you need is a knife. It's meeting the man of my dreams and then meeting his beautiful wife. Isn't it ironic? Don't you think? A little too ironic. Yeah, I really do think it's like rain. It's a free ride. It's the burning light. It's such a dusty day. And who would have thought it's bigger? Life is a funny place. Life is a funny, funny place. Helping you out.
Okay, so you may have written down a lot of things. I will tell you that that was the most difficult part about that was not singing along like I would normally do every time I hear that song. So I want to give you a second if you need to pause and go back and replay the song so that you can point out some things that you noticed, then go ahead and do that. Remember, hold yourself accountable. Nobody's there to watch you and make sure you do it. But if you don't have anything written down, just go back and find some things. There's plenty of examples. So before we end part two, I want to note some of the examples that I found. And you know, some people teach this different ways, and a lot of people will tell you that some of the examples aren't truly irony, it's just misfortune or bad luck, whatever you call it. But some of the examples that I pointed out, it's like 10,000 spoons when all you need is a knife line. And so there was, what was the other line? It's a free ride when you've already paid. A no smoking sign on your cigarette break. The one that I liked because I noticed some situational irony and verbal irony that I wanted to point out. Bonus points if you got this one. So Mr. Play It Safe was afraid to die. He packed his suitcase and kissed his kids goodbye, right? He waited his whole life to take that flight. Okay? And as the plane crashed down, ... So there is your situational irony. So play it safe. He doesn't take chances. His entire life, he never got on a flight because he wanted to play it safe, and then he finally does, and the plane crashes down. So there's some situational irony. What's cool about this line is it goes on to say, and as the plane crashed down, he thought, well, isn't this nice? So that is your example of verbal irony. So I love that line. That's my favorite line because it pairs situational and verbal irony in the same line. Of course, he didn't mean that it was really nice that the plane was crashing down. It's meeting the man of my dreams. He's perfect, right? Everything is so perfect. And then what happens? You meet his beautiful wife. Of course, all this time you were looking for the perfect person. There he is, and he's married. And so the other important line that she repeats over and over again, Alanis Morissette, is who would have thought it figures? And so that's the whole point, right? That's the whole point of irony. Who would have thought? No one, because these things are breaking our expectations and things are happening or being said that we don't expect. So who would have thought? Not us. And that is what makes it ironic. Thanks for joining me for part two, and we will see you again in part three.